Imagine this. A man calls a complete stranger at 2 in the morning. Not to ask for something. Not to sell anything. Not by accident. He calls because he found their name, somehow, somewhere, and he wanted them to know, before the night got any darker, that they were worth it. He did this for 30 years. 30 years of midnight phone calls to people he had never met, people who were struggling alone in the dark, people who had written him a letter or been referred by a friend or simply ended up in the orbit of his impossible attention. For 30 years, he showed up. And then, on a February morning in 2014, a door closed in the Hollywood Hills and everything went silent. No farewell. No announcement. No explanation. Just silence, heavy and absolute, from the man who had never once been quiet in his entire life. The world noticed immediately. Of course it did. And what the world did next tells you everything you need to know about the difference between watching someone and actually seeing them. Theories multiplied. Podcasts launched. Tabloids constructed villains. Detectives were dispatched. And through all of it, through every accusation and conspiracy and breathless headline, the man behind the door simply stayed inside. 10 years. 3,650 days of a silence no one could explain and no one could break. Until he decided to break it himself. He reached out to Diane Sawyer. He sent her flowers. Not one arrangement, not a polite gesture. He sent dozens of them, arriving like a declaration, each one carrying a small card with 5 words written on it. I trust you. And then, just as the interview was being arranged, just as the world was finally about to get its answers, he was gone. Richard Simmons died on July 13, 2024, one day after his 76th birthday. And what Diane Sawyer found when she went looking for the truth is not what anyone expected. It is not a conspiracy. It is not a crime. It is something far more devastating than either of those things. It is the story of a man who spent his entire life handing other people the words he himself most needed to hear. And it will change the way you think about everyone in your life who gives the most and asks for the least. Stay with me, because you need to hear all of it. And before we go any further, if stories like this one matter to you, the kind that go beneath the surface and find the real human being hiding behind the legend, make sure you hit subscribe right now and tap that bell icon so you never miss what we put out next. This one is going to take a while, and it is going to be worth every single minute. He was born on July 12, 1948, in New Orleans, Louisiana. And the city itself is important. New Orleans has always understood something the rest of America struggles to put into words, that joy and grief are not opposites. That the loudest music in the street and the deepest sorrow in the heart can exist in the same body at the same moment. That the people who make a room laugh the hardest are sometimes the ones carrying the heaviest thing. Richard Simmons was a New Orleans child in every possible sense. He was excessive. He was theatrical. He arrived in every space as though the space had been waiting specifically for him, as though the walls themselves had been holding their breath and could finally exhale now that he was there. But underneath all of that light, underneath all of that extraordinary combustion of personality, there was a boy who was in enormous pain. He was severely overweight as a child. Not slightly heavy, not what adults diplomatically describe as a big kid. Severely, visibly, cruelly overweight in the way that children notice and attack, and adults pretend not to see. He carried close to 300 pounds on a frame that had not yet figured out how to carry itself at all. The bullying was not the quiet kind that leaves no marks. It was the kind that follows a person for decades, that lives in the body long after the specific words have been forgotten, that rewires something deep and fundamental about how a person looks at their own reflection in the mirror. He was bullied so relentlessly that he was afraid to use the school bathroom. Let that land for a moment. A child so tormented that the most basic act of existing in a shared space became something to be avoided. That wound never healed. It went underground. It went very, very deep. And for 40 years, Richard Simmons answered that wound by doing the one thing he had always wished someone would do for him. He showed up for other people. The answer to how he became who he became begins not in Hollywood, but in Europe. In the 1960s, a young man from Louisiana found himself standing inside the museums and churches and galleries of Florence, Italy, surrounded by beauty so ancient and so completely unapologetic that it refused to negotiate with insecurity. Something cracked open in him there. Something shifted. He studied. He breathed different air. And when he came back to America, he came back with a direction. Not a plan exactly, but a direction. pointed toward the idea that a life could be built entirely around making other people feel magnificent. He arrived in Los Angeles the way ambitious young men from the American South have always arrived in Los Angeles. With more desire than plan, more personality than portfolio, more hunger than strategy. He took whatever work he could find. He moved through the city on foot, learning it through failure and the slow accumulation of small moments that do not announce themselves as important until years later. And then one day he saw a woman crying outside a grocery store. He did not know her. He had never seen her before. He wrote a note. He left it on her windshield. The note said she was beautiful. She wrote him back. That exchange, that instinct to reach through the glass that separates strangers from each other, was the entire architecture of everything Richard Simmons would ever build. That was the blueprint. Every phone call, every television appearance, every video cassette, every tearful moment in a fitness class in Beverly Hills, all of it traced back to that note on a windshield. In 1974, he opened Simmons in Beverly Hills. The name alone tells you something. Not a gym, not a fitness center, not a wellness studio with clean white walls, and the silent implication that your body is a problem requiring a clinical solution. He folded his own name into the purpose. His identity was inseparable from the mission. And what he built inside that studio was genuinely different from anything that existed in the American fitness world at that time. He was not selling discipline. He was not selling punishment. He was not standing at the front of the room with a clipboard and a stopwatch and the cold precision of someone who had confused efficiency with compassion. He was dancing. He was crying with people he had known for 20 minutes. He was looking directly at the men and women who had spent years being told their bodies were the problem, looking directly at them, and saying with everything he had, "You are not the problem. You have never been the problem." The television found him the way it always finds people who are too vivid for ordinary life. The Richard Simmons Show ran from 1980 to 1984. For years, 4 Daytime Emmy Awards, millions of viewers who turned on their sets in the morning and found something they had not expected to find at that hour. Genuine warmth, genuine absurdity, genuine unironic belief that the people watching from their living rooms deserved to feel good about themselves before the day had even properly begun. It was unlike anything on television before it, and unlike almost anything that has come since. And then came Sweatin' to the Oldies. 1988, a video cassette. A concept so simple it should not have worked. Richard Simmons in sequins, dancing to music from the 50s and 60s, surrounded by real people of every age and every size. None of them the idealized bodies that fitness marketing had always insisted were the only bodies worth showing. 22 million copies sold. 22 million. That is not a fitness product. That is a cultural document. That is evidence of a hunger that an entire industry had never once bothered to feed. The hunger of ordinary people to see themselves represented in the act of taking care of themselves. To see joy instead of punishment. To see inclusion instead of aspiration. He followed it with 65 fitness videos in total, 9 books and 3 cookbooks. A career spanning more than 4 decades. And through all of it, he called people. This is the detail that stops everyone who hears it for the first time. Not form letters, not newsletters, not social media posts addressed to millions and experienced by no one. He called. He found the names of people who were struggling, people who had written to him, people who had been referred, people who somehow ended up in the orbit of his extraordinary attention. And he picked up the phone and dialed their number. He talked. He listened. He remembered details. He followed up. Think about what that costs. Not in money, in attention, in emotional energy, in the daily choice to remain open and permeable and available, to refuse the insulation that fame almost always builds around a person. He refused that insulation every single day for 30 years. February of 2014 arrived without warning. No announcement, no press conference, no farewell tour or graceful final appearance. The calls simply stopped. The door of the Spanish-style mansion in the Hollywood Hills closed. And the man who had been impossible to reach because he was always already on the phone with someone else became impossible to reach for an entirely different reason. The world reacted immediately, and not always with grace. A wildly popular podcast in 2017 raised worried questions about his disappearance and framed his absence as a puzzle to be solved, a mystery with a hidden answer and possibly a villain. Tabloid magazines constructed elaborate scenarios. The most persistent and most disturbing theory was that his housekeeper of 35 years, Teresa Reveles, was somehow controlling him, holding him against his will, preventing the world from accessing the man it loved. The Los Angeles Police Department sent detectives to the house for a wellness check. Richard Simmons came to the door. He spoke to them. He told them he was fine. He convinced them completely. And they left. But here is the question that the Diane Sawyer special, which aired on ABC on May 12, 2026, and is now streaming on Disney Plus and Hulu, forces us to sit with. The question that is far more troubling than any conspiracy theory about a sinister housekeeper. What if the answer was always simpler? What if a man who had spent 40 years performing joy had simply run out of the energy required to perform it anymore? Teresa Reveles, the woman who knew Richard Simmons more intimately than perhaps anyone else alive during those years, sat across from Diane Sawyer and described what she actually saw inside that house. Not a prisoner, not a hostage, not a man being controlled against his will. She described a man who had been brought low by the cruelest possible opponent. Himself. He was insecure, she told Sawyer. He did not think he looked good anymore. He worried, with a specificity that breaks the heart to hear described, that someone would see him in public and say exactly those words. Richard Simmons is old. Richard Simmons does not look good anymore. Read that again. Let it actually land. This is the man who spent his entire career, his entire reason for existing in public, telling people that worth is not conditional, that beauty does not expire, that the body you are living in right now, not the body you are working toward, not the future body, not the body you had 20 years ago, but this one, right now, as it is, deserves love and movement and joy. He said those words 10,000 times. He wept saying them. He held strangers' hands saying them. He called people at midnight saying them. And he could not say them to himself. Not once. The camera, which he had used as an instrument of radical inclusion, pointing it at bodies the fitness industry had always hidden, became the thing he feared most. Teresa had promised him. Not just agreed. Promised. Never take a photograph of him. Not even inside the house. Not even in rooms where no one would ever see the image. As though the photograph itself, even unshared, even unobserved, would confirm something he could not bear to confirm. And so he found other ways to exist in the world. Sometimes he would go outside in disguise. Teresa described driving him through the city, taking him to see the new buildings and the new stores, the Los Angeles that had continued changing while he stayed still. Nobody recognized him, she said. And in that sentence you can hear both things simultaneously. The relief of a man who desperately needed to breathe air that was not filtered through other people's expectations. And the devastation of a man who had once been impossible to miss, now deliberately making himself invisible. Sometimes the disguise was a clown costume. Sometimes he dressed as a woman. His knees were failing him. And for a man whose entire identity, whose entire philosophy had always been expressed through the body in motion, through dance, through the exuberant physical fact of moving together, the loss of mobility was not merely a physical limitation. It was an existential one. The instrument through which he had delivered his message to the world was betraying him. And Richard Simmons, who had always responded to pain by dancing through it, could no longer dance. He had 6 Dalmatians. They were his constant companions through those years. The warm and uncomplicated and unconditional presence that does not look at you and see what you used to be. Does not compare you to an archive of past appearances. Does not need you to perform anything. They needed only what he had always been best at giving. And somehow, even when he could give it to almost no one else, he kept giving it to them. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months folded into years with the slow, merciless patience that time has when a person stops marking it with purpose. And the world outside continued to theorize and speculate and construct its stories. Because a world that loves a performer cannot easily accept that the performance has simply ended. It needs a villain. It needs a twist. It needs something more dramatic than the truth. Then something happened that shook him out of the stillness. In early 2024, it was announced that comedian Pauly Shore would be playing Richard Simmons in an unauthorized biopic. Simmons went on social media almost immediately. He had never given permission for the film, he said. He did not have a manager anymore, or a publicist. He was just trying to live quietly and peacefully. But the announcement woke something up in him. It made visible to him that the world was going to tell his story whether he participated or not. And if that was true, perhaps the only thing worse than being seen was being misrepresented. Around the same time, he began reaching out to Diane Sawyer. And what he did next was entirely, completely, heartbreakingly Richard Simmons. He did not send an email. He did not have his representative make a call. He sent flowers, dozens of them, arriving at Sawyer's office with the extravagance that had always been his native language, each arrangement carrying a small card with 5 words: "I trust you." When Sawyer finally spoke with him on the phone, she said something in the special that stops everything when you hear it. It was the old Richard. Whatever the decade of silence had cost him, whatever it had not taken that voice. The warmth was still there. The humor was there. The impossible sincerity that had once traveled through telephone wires into the hearts of millions, still intact. He told Sawyer he was ready to come and tell his story. He told her about the Broadway musical he was writing, called Full Circle, with composer Patrick Leonard. He had already completed 14 songs for it, and his brother Lenny told People magazine that Richard was so excited about the project that he would read the family the lyrics in poetry form as he wrote them. His specific instruction for the theater, characteristic and heartbreaking in equal measure, was to remove the seats from the front rows, so that people could come down from the audience and dance. Even then, even at 75 years old, in failing health, in the deepening shadow of everything the decade had taken from him, his instinct was still to tear down the barrier between performer and audience. Still to say, "Come down here. Come dance with me." No one should have to watch joy from a distance. The preparations for the interview began. And then on July 13th, 2024, one day after his 76th birthday, Richard Simmons died. Here is what actually happened in those final days, based on what the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner confirmed and what the Diane Sawyer special revealed. On July 11th, Richard Simmons experienced a fall inside his home. He spent the following day in bed. He was dizzy, he was injured, and he was afraid. Not of death, perhaps. Not of pain, which Teresa said he never once complained about regardless of its source. But of being seen. Of arriving at a hospital as Richard Simmons and having the world know that Richard Simmons had fallen. That the man who had spent his entire life rushing toward other people's vulnerability was now inside his own. His brother Lenny and sister-in-law Kathy had spoken to him on the phone that day. He sounded a little off, they said. The phrase carries so much weight in so few words. A little off. The way people describe someone they love when they do not yet know that the conversation they are having is the last one. Teresa found him on the morning of July 13th, unresponsive on his bedroom floor. He had been there for hours. Emergency responders were called. Death was pronounced at 9:45 in the morning. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner confirmed his cause of death as injuries sustained in a fall, with arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease as a contributing factor. His death was ruled accidental. The coroner also confirmed he had sustained a fracture in his left femur. Diane Sawyer said it plainly in the special, because plainness was the only register equal to the fact. If he had not been afraid to go to the hospital, things might have been different. He was buried in his classic workout clothes. The sequin tank top, the shorts, the outfit that had been his armor and his identity and his gift to the world for 4 decades. The visual shorthand for everything he believed about joy and movement and the radical, rebellious, deeply countercultural act of showing up. In death, as in life, he wore the uniform of his purpose. A celebration of his life was held at a Catholic church in New Orleans in October of 2024. The city that made him. The city that understands, better than anywhere else on earth, that the loudest music always rises from the deepest grief. And then just this month, in May of 2026, Diane Sawyer finally released what she had gathered. The Mystery of Richard Simmons aired on ABC on May 12th. Teresa Ravella spoke on camera for the first time. Lenny and Kathy Simmons shared what they knew. And the picture that emerged was not dark. That is the essential Richard Simmons thing, the thing that feels almost impossible to say, and yet is completely true. The picture is not a cautionary tale. It is not a warning. It is a love story. A complicated, imperfect, enormous love story about a man from Louisiana who decided very early and very deliberately that other people's joy was worth his entire life. He gave it every day for 40 years, without reservation, without asking for anything in return. And the tragedy is not simply that he died. The tragedy is the gap between what he offered the world and what he could offer himself. The gap between the man on the telephone at 2 a.m. telling a stranger they were worth it, and the man inside the Hollywood Hills mansion who could not look at his own reflection without flinching. He spent 40 years saying, "You are worth it. You have always been worth it." And he never once believed it about himself. The mansion in the Hollywood Hills, the house where the 6 Dalmatians kept him company, where the disguises hung by the door, where the decade of silence accumulated its weight in the absence of photographs, and the presence of a loyalty so profound that Teresa kept her promise every single day for every single year because he asked her to. That house was listed for sale at $5.79 million. An address, a number, a house that held 10 years of a story the world is only now beginning to understand. And the Broadway musical he was writing, Full Circle, 14 songs completed, the front seats removed so people could come down and dance. That musical will never open. Not the way he imagined it. Not with him in it, writing new songs each week and reading them in poetry form to his family over the phone. But here is what has not ended. The person who still has a voicemail from him saved on an old phone. The woman whose windshield once carried a note that said she was beautiful and who wrote him back. The stranger who answered the phone at 2 a.m. and heard a voice that somehow already knew their name. He is still giving it to them. That is his answer to the question he never answered for himself. The people who give the most, who show up first and stay latest, and call when no one else calls, they are not made of different material than the rest of us. They hurt the way we hurt. They age the way we age. They look in the mirror and see the same doubts and the same fears and the same accumulation of years. The only difference is they point all of that toward other people and almost none of it inward. And if you carry someone like that in your own life, someone who gives everything and asks for nothing, someone who hands you the words they themselves most need to hear, this is the moment. This is the moment to give those words back. Because if the story of Richard Simmons teaches us anything at all, it is that the people most fluent in the language of love are sometimes the ones most desperate to receive it. Tell us in the comments, do you have someone like that in your life? And if this kind of story matters to you, the ones that go past the headlines and find the real human being underneath, then you already know what to do. Subscribe. Hit that bell icon, because the next story is waiting, and it will not disappoint.